So let's begin with the informative session on white-collar crimes. On behalf of the IMC Chamber of Commerce and Industry, I would like to extend a very warm welcome to all our participants, dignitaries, speakers, and our esteemed panelists for sparing their valuable time for this interaction with the members of IMC. As we begin the session, may I request Mr. Ajit Mangrulkar, Director General, IMC Chamber of Commerce and Industry, to present the welcome address. Over to you, Mr. Mangrulkar.
Thank you very much, Selby, and a very good morning to everyone for today's informative session on white-collar crimes. IMC Chamber of Commerce and Industry, with the support of Cyril Amarchand Mangaldas and FTI Consulting, is going to take you all through this informative session on white-collar crimes. I think this is something which is being talked a lot in the news today. I believe there was some mention even in the papers today. So I think it's the need of the hour, and probably all of us are looking forward to what the speakers have to tell us. White-collar crimes are a big global concern, increasing at a very alarming rate. It has become a global phenomenon, and in India, it is increasing at a tremendous pace because of the rapid growth of the economy and industry. Due to the current situation, there has been an unusual and unexpected increase in the growth of computer-specific white-collar crime, which brings a great challenge for the law enforcement agencies, as these crimes can be committed from anywhere in the world by any anonymous person. There are many professions where criminal and unethical practices are going unnoticed. Today's session will provide an overview to white-collar crimes with a focus on identifying early warning signs of a white-collar crime, recognizing and dealing with regular fraud, key enforcement agencies under different statutes, and powers of such enforcement agencies. In addition, the session will focus on the importance of technology in investigations and the manner in which such investigations are practically conducted. This session will also aim at helping the audience the risks that they may be exposed to and the manner in which a white-collar crime investigation may be handled. We welcome today's speakers of the session, Mr. Prasad Shetty, Managing Director, Global Risk and Investigations, FTI Consulting, Mr. Ankush Mehta, Partner, Cyril Amarchand Mangaldas, Mr. Amit Jaju, Senior Managing Director, FTI Consulting, Mr. Aviral Sahai, Principal Associate, Cyril Amarchand Mangaldas, who is going to be the moderator of our panel. We wish everyone good luck, and we welcome all of you to this session. Over to you, Selby.
Thank you, Mr. Mangrulkar. May I now request Mr. Ankush Mehta, Partner, Cyril Amarchand Mangaldas, to present the brief introduction to white-collar crimes, scope, and legal thresholds. Over to you, Mr. Mehta.
Thank you. It's a great honor to be here with this, very august gathering, and thank you to the IMC team. Thank you to FTI to have us here virtually in front of everybody, so that we can give an introduction on white-collar crime, and then finally take you through a very shortlisted and select Q&A round, which will try and give you some very interesting insights into how a white-collar crime unfolds, what is the role of a prosecution, what is the role of a defense, and what is the role of a witness in a situation of this nature. Let me now begin by just briefly talking about, what is a white-collar crime to start with. I mean, I think the first question that should come to everyone's mind, what's so big deal about it? It's just an ordinary crime, and and you have the law enforcement that gets involved, and so on and so forth. I think I'll stop here and explain first that a white-collar crime is literally a crime that is something that is very sophisticated in nature. It's very different from an ordinary crime, also called a hard crime. It presupposes that you will have an individual or a set of individuals with a defined mental and mental capacity of intellect and intelligence, And, that's pretty much, to start with what a white collar crime or a white collar criminal is. It can be of various types. It can range from, something like fraud under various acts. It could be right from, a company that is involved in pharmaceutical to drugs to simple day-to-day manufacturing, supply chain, education. It could be in any form, in any sector of any type. You will also have a white collar crime that will include things like cybercrime, which is something, which honestly is a topic and an issue by itself. Every day we hear and learn of, credit card frauds and ATM frauds and bank frauds. Typically, anything that is done over the internet being used as a medium of transacting, would broadly qualify as a cybercrime. I don't think I would like to leave money laundering, tax evasion, insider trading behind, because these are equally of significant importance when it comes to talking or referring to what a white collar crime is. So, broadly speaking about the range or an inclusive description of what a white collar crime is, I think it necessarily follows what are the types of offenses that are covered in which types of laws, that exist in India today, that would, which when invoked would, be dealing with an issue of a white collar crime. Indian Penal Code, it's something that's been incorporated, as you would see, since 1860. It literally sets out all the broad substantive offenses of a crime. It defines what, offenses are bailable, non-bailable, cognizable, non-cognizable. It talks about several even relevant concepts such as anticipatory bail, criminal breach of trust, forgery, cheating, abetment, so on and so forth. Aviral, can you come back to the presentation, please? I'm not sure what happened to the screen. Okay, so anyway, I'll move on and.
The presentation is on.
No, sorry, it just went off on my screen. I'm sorry.
Okay.
So, yeah, and then, so as I said, the Indian Penal Code, offenses under the Information Technology Act is something, again, that is very, very, necessary to know, what this law contains. And, because most of the crimes today, especially in the lockdown situation that pretty much the entire world is committed over the platform of the World Wide Web, be it through, banks or, as I said, online transfers, credit card payments, etc., etc. And therefore, the Information Technology Act is something that becomes very, very critical, as one of the substantive laws which cover and regulate white collar crime. Bribery and Corruption, Prevention of Corruption Act, Prevention of the Money Laundering Act, and insider trading are some of the other very relevant concepts that, are and substantive laws that take care of issues of white collar crime. I'll pause here for a minute, and since I've explained briefly to the audience on what white collar crimes are, which are the laws that cover white collar crime, I think I'll spare 2 minutes to explain which courts in India typically should have jurisdiction over white collar crime matters. It typically starts from a magistrate court, which is as such the court of first instance. State-wise, it will differ as to which state and, which city would have a jurisdiction. But broadly, you can safely say that a magistrate court is the court of first instance when it comes to, instituting an action for a white collar crime. You would follow this in hierarchy with the Sessions Court. This would also have parallel or coextensive jurisdiction with sometimes a CBI court or a court of an economic offences wing. Higher up is the High Court, and finally the Supreme Court. So these are essentially a very, very broadish structure on the jurisdiction that exists within the country of India on how a white collar crime and the journey that any sort of an offense that qualifies as a white collar crime literally takes from a magistrate court right up to the apex court. I think the next point here to mention of relevance again is, where are white collar crimes found? I mean, where do you go looking for a white collar crime, or what qualifies today as a white collar crime? So let me start with any company, small or large, that can be exposed or can be victimized by a white collar crime. What are the checks and balances that exist or that should exist? And we will be, of course, talking about in this session what should be mitigation points or tools that are available to reduce the impact or to track out a white collar crime sooner than later. As everybody is familiar with, Companies Act, more or less some of the provisions that deal with accounting requirements and obligations. So the first step, again, very generalistically speaking, from a white collar crime is usually found from its books of accounts. Consists of ledgers, journal entries, reconciliation statements, financials, balance sheets. This would be the first port of call or the first instance to assess where is actually the offense that has happened. One can use the current financial statements and take it back to a few years or maybe even several years behind to understand, what is the pattern of the offense, assuming one has been, as the topic suggested, the detection of fraud. It's essentially a case where a company has been victimized and a fraud has been played on the company, as a result of which the company, in more cases, has been exposed to third-party liabilities, including those with their vendors or including those on a statutory account as well. Statutory account would mean with income tax, Ministry of Corporate Affairs, or any other regulator that the company would be, governed by. Of course, I'm going to also touch upon, where you have the banking sector, which is always, unfortunately, a immediate victim of a cyber threat or a cyber attack or a white collar crime. As you will notice that, there have been several cases over the last 10 years, before 2018-19, where a whopping 2 lakh crore frauds were detected and involved concerning banks and financial institutions. In 2018-19 alone, close to 72,000 crore of fraud was reported across 6,000, 7,000 cases. Of course, these would be cases that would be out in the open. There would be several cases which would be unreported, where a bank would be dealing, or it would still be in the nascency of being investigated and coming out in an open domain. One other very important aspect when it comes to white collar crime, or when it comes to an instance of fraud, is frauds played by an employee. This is not to be underestimated at all, because the higher an individual or an employee were to get in an organization, the higher his accessibility to information, confidential and otherwise, the higher is accessibility to very sensitive data of the company. And the only recommendation, or one big recommendation that we found from previous experience that will be very relevant here, is to ensure a very strong system of checks and balances as an employee goes ahead in his sort of employment curve within the organization. It could be in the form of non-disclosure agreements. It could be tightening up of other, sort of checks and balances within the company. But what our experience has found is that employee fraud or usage of sensitive or available information by an employee or senior employee against the company or against third parties, making the company a victim, is one of a very, very important aspects of white collar crime. This could be in the range of embezzlement, data fraud, data theft, something as simple as fabrication of vouchers, which undetected can result over a period of time in a massive loss of fraud to the company. Moving on to the next slide, how today, Evilu, just pausing here, I wanted to also bridge today that when we talked about, actions under Indian Penal Code or Companies Act, there is many laws that are being incorporated as we speak or amended, with knowledge of how do you tackle a new existing complex white collar crime. And what do I mean by this? The Prevention of Corruption Act was, amended recently, which talked about not only making a government employee or an employee who, is qualifies as a government servant, as a bribe taker, but also today private entities and private individuals who are bribe givers are also covered therein. Point number 2 is the Fugitive Economic Offenders Act, which was incorporated recently, a couple of years ago for a very famous case, which is pending in the UK. Again, a lot of thought-provoking situations, including powers being given to senior officers who qualify as officers of police or magistrates, have been given power of search and seizure, arrest, and attachment. So basically, I think the legislature is moving towards where there are crimes of such large nature and the time to react is a little less as compared to the damage done. The legislature is also moving towards, having sophisticated or very, very quick, short answers to sophisticated and drastic crimes. As we will see also moving on, that there are certain basic concepts of what a white collar crime is. And these would be something that any individual or, person who's not familiar with the concepts of white collar crime, we thought we will explain this in this presentation as well. Innocent until proven guilty. What is the difference between a bailable and non-bailable offense? What is a cognizable, non-cognizable offense? So on and so forth. I think to start with, it's upon what happens and what's the journey of a white collar crime. I mean, does it automatically happen? What does an individual need to do for something for the state to get involved, etc.? I will briefly explain that background while I'm touching upon these basic concepts. Today, as I was giving a previous example, today, if any employee or any company were to be a victim of a crime, what does he or she do? Of course, take the best legal advice possible, initiate a complaint before a police station, police officer, cybercrime enforcement directorate, or any magistrate, so as to speak. It is then upon the state, because then it becomes an offense of the state. It is then upon the state to prove beyond reasonable doubt that this offense was committed and the guilty is guilty as charged. So that's the first, this thing about innocent until proven guilty. Bailable and non-bailable offenses is again a very simple concept that is existing since the last several decades. A bailable offense is one when the police officer has the authority to grant bail. Usually these are offenses which are punishable up to a period of 2 years. Non-bailable is something where it's only the magistrate that has the power or the discretion to grant bail depending on circumstances in front of it. Cognizable offense is one where an arrest can happen without a warrant. A non-cognizable is the reverse situation. Mens rea and actus rea are again concepts incorporated from sort of foreign terminologies and foreign laws. Mens rea means a guilty mind. So a guilty mind needs to exist today to commit a crime. A crime committed, for instance, a very basic example, a crime committed or an action committed as a result of which damage has been done from a point of self-defense can be said to be an offense, but can be mitigated by the fact that there was lesser or no guilty mind or mens rea attached to it. What's the difference between a summons as a warrant case? We will explain this as we go along in the case studies. But any offense which is punishable less than 2 years typically qualifies as a summons case. A warrants case is any offense that is over and above 2 years punishment. An action of what is an anticipatory bail. It's literally where a person apprehends arrest. So that's the meaning where any individual who is apprehending arrest has the ability and the liberty to approach a court to grant anticipatory bail to it. Of course, an anticipatory bail doesn't come as they phrase, there are no free lunches. It comes imposed with a set of stringent conditions. Usually, an anticipatory bail is only sought for when a first information report, that is an FIR, which I will also come to very quickly, is registered against the person concerned. There is a very, very leading case which the audience and participants may note, which is a Lalita Kumari case, which is a Supreme Court case that really talks about what is an FIR and what are the conditions in which an FIR can be registered. And this is pretty much the Bible that is being followed today by law enforcement officers all across the country to register an FIR from a private complaint or not. An FIR is typically a starting point of a case, that is from where a case is registered in the first instance, right up to a charge sheet being formed or framed, right up to the entire process of a trial in a criminal case, and then which finally leads to an acquittal or a conviction of the accused concerned. I also want to pause here for a minute to explain, unfortunately, on a no-name basis for the benefit of the audience, that we had the benefit of advising on a case which included aspects of anticipatory bail. But in that particular case, an FIR was not registered, but the circumstances were such that those people concerned at hand were under an imminent threat of arrest. So what had happened was that, there was a complaint against a couple of people on account of certain intimidation or blackmail that they were accused of. They had come to us and asked, what should be the best remedy? And considering that there was no FIR that was filed, we had advised them to anyway seek protective action from the court. The court understood our grievances on behalf of the clients, and finally said, sort of disposed of the matter by giving a direction to the public prosecutor who was appearing on behalf of the police to say that even if you do land up arresting these particular individuals, we're not commenting onto the main or the bona fides or the lack of them of a crime, but you will give a sufficient 14-day notice before the arrest actually were to happen. This saved a lot of anxiety and stress for those people in question, because effectively it granted a window of 2 weeks for the potential accused persons to take preventive steps in the event the police were to give them a notice of arrest. Of course, having said that, it is always better to cooperate with law enforcement agencies and to essentially assist them while the complaint or the offense is being investigated. This also goes a long way in assessing and ensuring that the police know that you are in fact on the right side of the law and not here to defeat or extort from anything from the law. Another aspect that comes into mind here is that while there are two buckets literally of an accused and a complainant, there is also a very important dimension that while you don't find this on your screen, it is also something to do with where you are a witness. The Criminal Procedure Code talks about what and who a witness is, and under Section 91, this again, many of you could be faced potentially, where you are just the platform or the intermediary through which the crime has happened. You are probably not responsible at all, but effectively the police in the course of investigation or the law enforcement in the course of investigation would believe that you have such relevant and significant information that would lead the accused to a potential conviction or a potential acquittal. So again, whenever you are being served what we call with a Section 91 notice, it could be either your personal presence is required, or it could be that you are in possession, as I said, of information which could be bank accounts, KYC documents, which you will be at duty bound to produce to the law enforcement agencies. Effectively, this is really, the few things that go on behind the scenes. Bail, again, as I've talked about, is that, in circumstances where the law enforcement officers can themselves grant bail. If it's an offense which qualifies as a punishment over a period of 2 years, it's usually the magistrate. The sections of the Criminal Procedure Code are in front of your screens. One important right that is available to an accused or a potential accused or an unfortunate accused when he's dragged into the scheme of things is approaching any high court under its inherent powers, under 482 of the Criminal Procedure Code. So inherent powers essentially mean those powers which are excessively wide, where the police can, call upon the records, squash the summons, squash the FIR, squash the proceedings if it believes prima facie that you are being wrongly charged or wrongly victimized. So these are some of the provisions that exist as such, where a white collar crime could be the subject matter of an issue. As I've said that, it becomes very necessary in a white collar crime to understand what your position is. Are you in the position of a complainant? What's the duty to discharge from your side? If you're in the position of a potential accused, what is the best defense that you can put forward when it comes to being accused of an offense? The third thing, as I mentioned, is when you're a witness, the police or the law enforcement or the court would believe that you have the right evidence available, untampered and unqualified, that could be possibly lead to a more definitive solution in the case. What I also want to pause here and talk about very briefly is, when you have critical circumstances that arise, what we call in our common legal parlance is a special situation that arises, or an issue or an event of crisis management. What, for example, today an income tax raid were to happen in your office? What tomorrow if a serious fraud investigation office raid were to happen? What tomorrow for if an enforcement directorate were to visit your office and raid, raid your books of accounts, raid your computers, raid your employees, mobile phones, so on and so forth. We will be talking about this in the standard operating procedure. But before I leave it to Aviral to get into what, to moderate some of the relevant questions, I do want to say that typically in an issue like this, the first 24 to 48 hours become most defining in the case. I mean, what is it that, how are you reacting, to a situation in this fashion? Who is the correct person within the employment of the organization to give the right statement or give the right answers? What is the protocol that is to be followed within the rest of the employees? These things become very evident or very important when it comes to giving information or what the law enforcement officers are looking for. What is the verification that you need from the law enforcement? Are they simply, imposturing as law enforcement? Do they need to carry a warrant, or do they need to carry a search and seizure, order from the court to say that, they have the power to investigate? I mean, these things we can leave for another time, but I think these things become extremely effective and required about how the case unfolds. Aviral, you may want to, okay. There's also, the exposure of stakeholders. So today, when there are investors in a company, shareholders, what is their liability that needs to be assessed from a company law, SEBI law, and other sort of corporate law perspectives. One thing is very important is, the role or the liability of the board and the management. Typically, unless they have said otherwise, or unless they have an action to defend or prove otherwise, they are usually held to be accountable, because that's where the company's sort of head and function of the management typically is. Key managerial personnel, company secretaries, CFOs, CEOs are also pretty much people who are executive and running of the important operations of the company. Certain senior employees as well, it becomes very important to sort of know and discharge their obligations. Last but not the least, when you are talking to third-party vendors and customers, completing the essential KYCs and the essential checks and balances also in a situation like ours cannot be underestimated.
Thank you, Ankush, for that portion. I think before taking questions on white collar crimes, we can directly move on to the panel discussion, which may perhaps clarify a few essential tenets of white collar crimes for the audience at large, and then we can take a consolidated set of questions. So very warm welcome to everyone. We've already been introduced to Ankush, Amit, and Prasad. We'll directly jump into our panel discussion, which is effectively titled "Being Ready for a White Collar Crimes Investigation and What Should We Be Aware of." Now, and this is before getting into the questions itself. What normally comes to our mind is we start to think about white collar crimes only once we are met with a situation. So I'd like to put forward a situation for all the panelists today. So in a situation where there is a foreign owned private company, for instance, which is involved in manufacturing and exporting products, and in this company, an employee, say, forges certain demand notices, which are purportedly issued by customs authorities, and in connivance with a customs house agent, induces the company to make certain payments, which payments, of course, have been siphoned off by these employees. Now, for the employee who has forged demand notices, challans, and receipt stamps of even custom authorities, a question to Ankush would be, in a situation like this, what actions would you suggest the company to take? As in, what all should the company be concerned of, and what are effectively the charges that can be made out in such a situation?
Thanks, Aviral. I think, to start with, how did this entire thing even allow to happen? And, what was the role or the position this particular senior employee had within the system? Who was he reporting to the board? Did he have some independent parallel vertical? And, ultimately, what's the impact of the frauds that have been committed as well on the balance sheet of the company? Yes, of course. I mean, at the outset, this appears to be prima facie, immediate corrective actions need to be taken. However, and which will include, if there is issues with the customs, approaching the customs. If it's a threshold of about 5 crore Indian rupees, it's about approaching the economic offences wing of the Bombay Police, and basically filing a private complaint, with the law enforcement. And that helps in two parts. It helps in showing your bona fides as an organization that you were not involved and you're keeping a distance with the crime. And at the same time, it sort of sets the investigation machinery into action. Pausing here for a minute, I think the role that the experts play in a scenario like this should not be underestimated, in the sense that, while the police were to register a first information report and investigate the case further, having had the benefit to work with experts like Prasad and Amit as such, I think it'll be very relevant to understand from them as well what goes behind the scenes. So, Aviral, you may want to ask them, what really happens behind the scenes.
Absolutely. So Prasad, in a situation like this, how relevant do you think it is for an entity to engage in forensic diligence on receipt of information that a fraud or a similar offense has been committed?
Hi, good morning, everybody. So the question is quite relevant because, whenever a fraud comes into picture, or when there is an incident of fraud which is identified by a company, what to do next, or should be reported to the police directly. So it is very important. Just to go back to what Ankush had mentioned, our law states that, innocent until proven guilty. So you cannot file a complaint without having adequate evidence of the wrongdoings or the frauds. So the first thing to do is to gather as much evidence as possible, and the evidences are available in multiple forms and formats. To the example that you gave, the person who has forged the demand letters from the customs, he would have coordinated with the clearing and forwarding agency. So the evidences here would be, the formats that he has used on his computer. If he's a tech savvy guy, in fact, you need not be even tech savvy. A decent knowledge of PowerPoint or a Microsoft Paint, is good enough for people to forge documents nowadays. You can scan documents, you can update that in your computers, and get that thing done. So first thing is to look at his computers. Again, the procedures how to look at computers. Not just you just go into his computer, log in, and copy all the data into your hard drive and look at it. So there are procedures which have to be done. So Amit will delve into that. But one aspect is looking at the evidences, how the forgery happened. Second important clue on this one would be his communications with the clearing and forwarding agency. So there would be a lot of mail exchanges saying that, okay, this is the invoice which has come, or this is the demand which has come, but let's have some side deal wherein I will make sure that, you get so much payment and, you can transfer this back. Some kind of formal, informal communication happens. So getting all this together is important. Another point which brings out the practical reality in the enforcement side. Our enforcement agencies are overloaded with cases. They are stretched to the limit when it comes to white collar crimes. So the expectation that, you give the case to the police and they will investigate from, top to bottom without, giving any delays in that, it's a, fast stretch argument. So it is better for us to, give the material which is required by the enforcement agencies so that their work becomes easier. And like every organization or every person, so long as you are able to assist them in what they are looking at, and you are able to provide things to them, then your case moves much faster in the court of law also. So that's my view on that.
That's very helpful, Prasad. I think you raise an important point. It is perhaps getting easier nowadays for people to commit technological offenses. So, Amit, in this situation, from a forensic expert's perspective, what are the steps that you would take to analyze data, to identify the forgery, to identify money trail, and basically audit the accounts? What steps would you normally take?
Sure. I think as Prasad pointed out, you don't have to be an expert in technology to commit this kind of fraud using technology. In fact, now there are tools available to create these fake invoices and bills, right? There are websites available where you can provide a sample logo of, a receipt or an invoice or a purchase order that you want to forge. And in fact, somebody else will do it for you and give it to you. So there are websites available. In fact, we have done a lot of cases where just the expense receipts of different hotels can be, made available by these websites, which you can claim as a genuine bill. So the most important thing here is to have a collection and preservation of relevant information or data to be completed. So the most important is collection of the laptop, right? Where you can conduct forensics and identify if there are certain PDF files, images, any document, and any hint of websites being visited or a software that is used potentially for forging these files. And I think more often than not, if the person who is guilty, then we do end up getting this evidence. So from a forensic standpoint, it is not just that data that is there on the machine. If it has been deleted, if he has cleared history of his browser, even then we can recover all this data. And in today's world, everything is interconnected. So if his browser has his Google signed in and the phone also is Android, so together there's a lot of data exchange in terms of history, bookmarks, messages, notifications, which could be extracted from either of the devices.
Right. So Ankush, in this situation, do you have any factual situations where you've seen this become relevant?
So not really related to this. I wanted to, while we talk about, I wanted to give a different perspective. Some actually are real instances which border on certain things that may raise the audience's level of disbelief that does a thing like this actually happen. And I have come across two instances, again, matters that we've had the occasion to deal with, where in a particular situation, there was, from an employee's account, we had to recover the email account the employee was using, which had company data. So when we went to the court, because it was a cybercrime case, we went to the court to ask the court to direct the particular employee to hand over the account. And this falls within Companies Act case under Section 452, where you recover company property. You won't believe this, but we had to explain to the judge what an email account was, and it becomes very difficult today when the client is not in front of you to actually let the client know that the judge we're struggling with those concepts. So I think the question also is, of course, later on, things were understood, but this was in a very, very, very interior part of the country. Not that it's an excuse, but so there is a wide gap between today what we as lawyers or experts like FBI know, talk about, have access to, and including those criminals. But, at the end of the day, do the law enforcement agencies or the members of the judiciary sitting up there, are they really equipped to do justice in a case like this? That's the first point. The second point was another matter where, again, dealing with not so much technology, but dealing with a technological instrument. We were advising another person who was a security detail officer, for a group who was moving on a holiday. Basically, he was there to escort the group from a city to another. And he was unfortunately carrying a satellite phone. And satellite phones, after the terrorist attacks in India, have been banned. And the poor chap, not being Indian, not being advised, was arrested because he was carrying a satellite phone. And how? Because through the customs, through the scanner of the international airport, the phone wasn't picked up. What was picked up was his pair of scissors. And then finally, what we're trying to say is that he was charged under the Indian Telegraph Act, which again, there are so many issues that can come up when we talk about a white collar crime, it was completely unintentional. But I think what you're trying to say is anything that potentially has something that can go wrong can become a white collar crime. Doesn't have to be so harsh, doesn't have to be so in your face. So I think that's the other perspective that we wanted to just share with the audience, from our experience. Avril, over to you.
That's very helpful. What Ankush effectively is saying, that personal liability or the responsibility on individuals and entities becomes much higher in white collar crimes to even mitigate it. So Prasad, let me ask you a question here for the benefit of the audience. What would be some of the key red flags that a management of a company should be on the lookout for when being faced with a potential case of a fraud?
Before we answer that question, it's very difficult to, I would say that, fairly impossible to control a fraud in any organization. Fraud by its own design means that, you are doing something to deceive a person, which, you are circumventing processes and you're doing things which are not meant to be done with the intention. The, underlying the principle of a fraud is there has to be an intent. Otherwise, it's just a mistake. If you have made an excess payment to a vendor, without having any benefit out of it, or without having proper checks and balances, it's a mistake. But if you're getting some benefit out of it, that becomes a fraud. So for a company to watch out for red flags, there are a lot of indicators. There are personal sides of people where there are certain traits of fraudsters that we have seen over a period of time, and there are a lot of publications which are there. But some of the indicators would include, employees who are handling multiple responsibilities, even conflicting responsibilities, like a person who is also responsible for vendor onboarding as well as making the payments. Lavish lifestyle of people, which is not commensurate to their, salary packages. It could be possible that they are, have family wealth and, there are reasons which they have it. But, more or less, there are people who would be earning, say, probably 50,000 or a 60,000, but wearing a Rolex in office. That kind of instance we have seen. High employee turnover in a department. Human nature is not, inherently bad. So if you have, say, one bad apple in the organization which is not being taken care of, there are a lot of good people who are not able to adjust to that atmosphere. So if you see a high turnover in a particular department or in a particular function, then it becomes a red flag for you. For an outsider, compensation is also one of the important aspects. So if a CFO is getting paid 3 times of the industry average, that means that, he is paid to, do certain things which is not, as per the industry standards. If you look at the famous Satyam case which happened, which long back, the internal audit head was the highest paid internal auditor in the country. So that was the reason, but he was also implicated in the case because he also derived benefits out of the fraud which was happening. So there are, other indicators like, employees who are working late hours, late nights. There are obviously pressures, but, generally what we have seen is the profile of a fraudster. He is not somebody who is a low performer. He is typically a high performer, superstar in the office, having very good interpersonal skills, where the management has a lot of trust and confidence in that person, and they exploit that trust and confidence. The other indicator is having a very close relationship with the third parties or vendors. Having a formal professional relationship is one thing, but having very close family ties, going out for drinks and dinner with vendors all the time, visiting their offices more or less, going on vacations together, those kinds of red flags that we see, which typically indicate to some kind of red flags in the organization.
That's very helpful. So let me throw open a question to the entire panel, and I'll start with Amit here. We are today in the midst of a global crisis. The COVID pandemic is creating a lot of problems in terms of businesses being able to cope with this situation. Corollary of that is employee layoffs are happening, retrenchment is happening, and at this juncture, entities may be slightly apprehensive about data breaches and breach of confidentiality when one employee moves from their organization to, say, a competing organization. So, Amit, have you seen these issues crop up in the recent times? And if so, then what should a company or an entity be on the lookout for if they can, to try to avoid these kind of crises?
Thanks, Avril. I think, yes, it's very relevant in this scenario. Since the lockdown happened, I think a lot of businesses scrambled to enable their business to function remotely. So a lot of employees who traditionally would not be given access to VPNs and remote access to company systems were immediately given access. Also, there are certain systems which were never meant for remote access, right? Especially you're talking about, say, in banks, you have the core banking systems meant for operation only at the branches. You have certain payment systems or bank account details which were never shared with employees. Only through a physical token you would get access to those bank accounts. So a lot of these things had to be remote enabled. And what has also happened is, in parallel, that companies have laid off in certain industries. People have been laid off, and those people had confidential information, whether it is customer records, client information, intellectual property. So these two angles: one is on giving access to people, which can be misused, and second, people who already had data will no longer turn up to office anymore. So in these two situations, we have worked on several cases recently where we had to remotely monitor centrally at the company's site to see who's copying data to external storage. So we have seen cases where somebody had resigned, but before resignation, 7 or 10 days before resignation, he was copying a lot of data on a USB drive at home. So that alert through a central server, we managed that, and then had to confront the employee and remotely take access. We had to ask him that this is the hard drive you attached, bring it back, and we had to remediate it. So forensically, we had to clean up those devices wherever he had attached. We also had to make him open up his cloud storage and personal accounts just to ensure that he has not copied information there. On the other side, when system access have been opened up, the companies are running against time, because more and more people had to be given access, because they thought, okay, this is only for a few weeks and the lockdown will settle and then we'll have things back to normal. But the things back to normal is not in sight anymore. So enabling certain logging is most important. There were cases where we have seen even senior executives sharing their account details with their EAs to approve payments and make certain approvals. And that is a big risk situation in today's time. So user awareness and employee awareness was also critical. So you can always have a stick, and you can always have too many controls, but creating that level of awareness was also important. So doing a session with key user groups and senior people to tell them that these are the risks, you have been given access, but ensure you do this and you don't do that. Some level of monitoring also is happening on a daily, weekly, monthly basis. And if a situation has been found, so if there is a data leakage, deliberate one, so it falls under white collar crime. So you have to follow that process. If somebody's become vulnerable, so the phishing attacks are on the rise. So many emails, whether using COVID as a situation or using vendor information or original invoices and POs as a bait for people to send emails to employees and ask them to make payments, because you can't even physically take approval anymore. So now I'm hearing there are voice modulation software also, where people make phone calls and the voice sounds similar to the source recording that you can provide to the software. So from a social engineering standpoint, this is a nightmare, because you can't no longer even trust phone calls if it is coming from somewhere. And as you know, numbers can be spoofed and SMSs can be sent from any number. And you would get an SMS from your boss that, I have just sent you an email, please approve this payment. So in a typical situation, you will approve this payment, and this will go to a fraudulent bank account. So what controls need to be, implemented in this situation considering the various risks and what is happening in the dark web is all that you have to train your people in.
That's very relevant. I think this does put us in a peculiar situation, and I think most companies will be learning and evolving as we go. But let me just bring us back to the main topic then for a moment. We have understood the importance of what a forensic audit or a forensic report would be. This becomes especially important in context of bank frauds. I believe in 2018-19, India saw more than 70,000 crores worth of bank fraud reported. So at many times, banks or financial institutions employ forensic audits or just chartered accountants who do an audit of a borrower's account. So Ankush, have you seen a faulty inspection or a faulty expert forensic audit being done where it becomes an issue in future? And how do our courts perceive private forensic reports?
Yeah, I think it's a very relevant question looking at the size of issues of fraud that we are talking about. I think the first, we have seen reports basically, which is including a process of evidence gathering, which are not helpful because usually these are massive frauds or accounts we're talking about, could be external or internal. And to start with, the lawyer is always, is sort of always the last port of call. And, he's been always asked to say that I need a very clear watertight case. And that's where actually the problem emerges. Because, in a given situation, an ideal approach should have been where a bank or a institution which is a victim of fraud comes to us, at least as a first instance, or if not, along with the expert. So we work in tandem with the expert to, give the guidelines of, what can fly as an evidence before a regulator, a court, a law enforcement officer to make that watertight case. We have been, given reports which lack in, basic fundamentals of how the data was, retrieved, whose computer it was retrieved from, what is the offense being charged. And as, I was having a benefit of a chat with Prasad some time ago, where that, the importance or the depth of the report will be seen by how many caveats or qualifications are there at the end. And, these things sort of go a very long way in determining really what the quality of the output really is, or in fact, is it just that a report is being made for the heck of it, or there is actually something, to think about or to penetrate into. So yeah, we have seen, our hands have been tied, in several cases, and given those situations, it does become very difficult then to pick up from where it is left off. And, to make the case that ultimately the client is envisaging, because the client is having look at it from a client's case or from a third party's case. The client is having conversations internally. The client is having conversations with the experts, and the client is having conversations with the lawyers. And it's ultimately for the lawyer to bring this together. So the idea is, in an ideal world, your report should be watertight, but it does happen when we are faced with challenges, then we just sort of, move into the circumstance, or then go back to the expert to issue an additional report.
Right. So, Amit, how do you see yourself as an expert forensic, in an expert forensic diligence, acting differently from, say, a regular audit, or the kind of approach that an investigating authority by the state or center operate? How do you see your port of call being slightly different, if at all?
Sure. I think one distinction we should definitely have in India is, statutory audit, internal audit, and forensic audit, right? So typically a statutory audit and an internal audit, they predominantly follow the same kind of textbook and school of thought, right? From accounting standpoint, audit standpoint, where you request information from the management, you receive that information, then you rely on that information, right? That is predominantly how it is done. And a lot of times I've seen, at least in India, a lot of internal audits are repurposed into forensic audits, right? Predominantly management has approached, firms they are familiar with or partners they are familiar with who have maybe done internal audit in the past for them. And they said, okay, I need to do a forensic audit on, say, a vendor or a third party we are trying to acquire. And, can you do that for us? So, but generally from a that report would come from an internal audit standpoint, because that's the process the firm follows. In doing internal audit, they might do maybe 4 or 5 additional steps, but the whole kind of the theme of the report and the work being carried out would be more from an internal audit standpoint. Whereas a forensic audit would have a professional skepticism on everything, right? So for instance, if we are investigating Satyam, now we would not even trust the accounting system, right? As forensic auditors, we would have a doubt on this entire system itself. We would have doubt on everything. So there'll be questions on every single aspect. So, as eventually was found out in Satyam, there was a parallel bookkeeping system. The entire accounting system had a replica, which was maintained, one exposed to auditors and one which was actually the one the promoters which were using. So having professional skepticism and doubting everything and looking from a forensic angle, as Prasad said, if you have a document, you see, can it be tampered by somebody? Is it tampered, for instance? How do you check that? Then of course the technology comes into play there to check, if this document has been tampered. If you're a bank, and if I'm RBI and I'm conducting a forensic audit on a bank, especially if there are a lot of NPAs, you would generally go into the loan management system and see, okay, how many accounts are in the NPA category as per IRAC norms. That is fine, and you take that report and submit. But there could be a question, a forensic auditor might say, but hang on, let me see the logs and see how many loans were reinitiated just before they were going into the lower category or before getting classified as NPAs. So just before they were getting classified as NPA, what's the latest movement in these accounts? So when we did that for a bank, we saw some cyclic, back-end changes into the system where the IT vendor, under influence from the suspect, was making changes into those specific accounts and changing their IRAC norms, which wouldn't get caught. And then after the audit is opened, he'll turn it back on, right? So these details, is what a forensic audit would focus on. And of course, independent and conflict of interest is critical. At times we have seen that the reports themselves were not open. Just from a prima facie perspective, it was clear that there is a conflict of interest in terms of business relationship between the investigating firm or its partners and between management or other related parties. So that conflict of, so if I'm having, say, 100 crore relationship with this company on different service lines, but now I'm trying to offer a forensic audit to them, I'm conflicted, right? Whether I do statutory audit or not. So if I've set up their IT systems, but now I'm trying to do a forensic audit, it's a conflict of interest. And that would be evident in the reports also.
Right. Right, absolutely. So, Prasad, let me take you back to a point that Ankush perhaps made. He said that there may be some times when there are caveats or limitations as a forensic expert that you may have on your diligence. So I have a two-part question. What are the regular pitfalls that you might see in assessing evidence which would form your limitations or caveats? And secondly, where do you see your role stopping? Is it when the report is done, or do you even perform activities as an expert witness during trial?
So I think I'll not answer this in a technical way, rather I'll give you an analogy. So if you are having a pain on the left side of your body, would you go to a physiotherapist or a cardiologist? That's the balance, because generally people think that any kind of forensic audits can be done by any chartered accountant firms or any private investigators. I think that's the critical mistake which happens, because while doing forensic investigation, especially in a white collar crime in a corporate environment, there are a lot of do's and don'ts which have to be adhered to. So otherwise it becomes some limitations. We have had multiple cases which were handed over to us because of some botched up investigation in the prior which was done. So I'll just give you a couple of examples. One example was where one employee was investigated. They did not find any evidence, but the management was pretty sure that this was the person who had done all the fraud, but no evidence was gathered. When we looked at his laptop, we observed that his mail size was very limited. So when we went back to the company and said that this is the only laptop he was using, they said no. He was there in the company for about 8 years. This laptop was given to him 2 years back. So what happened to the data which was prior to 2 years? So then we had to pull out from the servers and then look at that data, and that gave a lot of crucial information and some backup data which was never even imaged or looked at by the earlier investigator. So having a wholesome completeness approach is important. Second instance is where some interviews were conducted by the employees of a finance team where some financial irregularities were happening. And none of the interviews gave any tangible output in the first round. When we checked, who were present at the interview, we also learned that the finance head was sitting in the interviews. And later on, when we spoke to the individual employees without having anybody else present, they spoke about the finance head saying that, he was involved in a lot of things. Obviously, when he is sitting in the meeting, they will not come out and talk about things. So having, the right team to, be part of the investigation, not spreading it out too much, because these investigations are confidential. And if you have your boss who is also doing the fraud and somebody asks you in front of him, what are the, red flags or, problems that you have in your department, 99% of the employees will not speak up in front of their bosses. So having the right people there is also important. Some of the limitations would be, having, failing to investigate, the right areas. If there is a whistleblower complaint or some allegations which are there, not investigating the full scope, or rather looking at only bits and pieces because of time or, budgetary constraints or, things like that. Involving too many people in the investigations, again, it depends on the structure of the company, but most companies that have a very good internal mechanisms have a, compliance committee, which is 1 or 2 people. Like you have the ICC for sexual harassments, even for financial complaints, you have a very specific committee which only deals with such kind of cases. And this becomes like the talk of the town, or, the corridor gossips where, this happened and this person was involved. So having that loose conversation should be avoided, because once things go out, then a lot of data is destroyed or people get to know about these things. The last aspect on the limitations is on the tampering with the evidence. For example, digital evidence we spoke about a lot, but generally what happens is, in the enthusiasm, some of the companies just take up the laptops or ask the employees to give their mobile phones and just do a copy paste or try to go into their laptops and see and search for documents. It loses the hash value. What we call in the technical terms is, when we do a copy, it is a bit by bit imaging. So the entire laptop is copied onto our systems using a bit by bit image, so that somebody cannot question the integrity of the data or say that somebody has planted evidence in my computer, or you have put some emails backdated. Unless you do that, employee may say that my laptop is unlocked, people would have come in and put some information. So having a bit by bit image, which is a scientific process, and this is also admissible in court of law, not just in India, but in the international cases also. So whenever we do cases for international jurisdiction, the imaged data is always the preferred one. Having that sanctity of the data is also one of the key aspects on.
Right. I think you bring out good points. I think what we are there moving into is that there may be steps that a company or an entity should take to improve their internal systems, to not just be reactive in nature, but also be proactive to mitigate such situations in the future. So we have about another 5 minutes left for us. So I'll just throw this to the panel, go first to the forensic investigators, and then perhaps take Ankush's perspective on a lawyer's idea as to what steps or what should a company do to improve its internal systems to mitigate a possible issue. Prasad, you've touched upon a few. If you have a few more points, then we can do that. Move on to Amit thereafter.
So I think the first and foremost, which is important than any policy, procedure, or any guidelines that you have in the company, is the tone at the top. People don't look at policy procedures or read guidelines. They emulate their seniors in the and they look at their leaders. So if the leader is somebody who is a man of integrity or a person of integrity, person of integrity, and who has high values, that kind of organizations typically are less prone to frauds, because having the tone at the top is the most important aspect. People who are organizations which are very clear on the code of conduct and they have zero tolerance for frauds, typically tend to have lesser kind of frauds, or the magnitude of frauds is much less in that. The second most important aspect is having a robust whistleblower mechanism. That is also mandated by the Companies Act, and it is mandatory for all companies. But what happens is, some of the companies just have it for the for the sake of having it, like a tick in the box, where they just have one email ID which nobody monitors. And if you look at how frauds are discovered, it is almost more than 50% of the frauds have come out with tips or whistleblowers. None of the audits or internal review systems are able to identify frauds. So whistleblowing is the only mechanism which has a lion's share in identifying fraud. So having a robust whistleblowing mechanism, having a whistleblower protection policy, having a seamless investigation of the whistleblower complaints that is received, that also goes a long way. Finally, you need to have certain policies, code of conduct, which are written and communicated well to the employees. Again, communication is very important. Having it on paper doesn't help. Going and giving them regular trainings about how to raise complaints about wrongdoings which are happening in the company, because 1% of the employees may be fraudsters or dealing in this kind of behavior, but 99% of the employees are watching this happen. And if they keep quiet, then this fraud will not come out. Out of this 99, you need one person who will speak up for you and identify these things. So having this communication and comfort given to the employees is important. So I think these are some of the pillars to. There are obviously a lot of other things which a companies can do, but the key takeaways are these three: where having a good tone at the top, having good whistleblower mechanism, and having a seamless communications with your employees and giving them the comfort.
Right. Amit, would you have any points to add to that?
Amit, we can't hear you.
Sorry, I was on a physical mute. So in addition to what Prasad just said, I think one important area is to have some deterrence in the environment, because a lot of times these frauds are committed because the employee feels that nobody is watching and nobody can catch me. I'm too smart. Now, having deterrence is important in the way where you need to have the right processes. When you document certain processes, make sure there are some examples given that these are the known fraud schemes that can take place, and this is our process to tackle with it. Because you can have the most sophisticated technology, but if the process is not set correctly, you can't attack with these small scenarios the individual fraud schemes just by deploying more and more technology or preventive measures. So the process has to be robust. So I'll give you an example. Phishing as an incident, right? A lot of companies are receiving emails, they're in fact making payments. But when we investigated those incidents, we found that no matter what you do, unless the company reviews their entire procure to pay process and has the right controls in place and educate the employees, it can always go bad for them in all situations. Similarly, you're looking at ransomware as an issue, for instance. So looking at the process, documenting it correctly, and educating the employees on a regular basis, whether it is by closed classrooms, virtual meetings, peer learnings, for instance, train one person, he trains others, on the job. So that is very important. But if you haven't identified the risk in your business processes and have not documented, that itself is a first step towards failure. So I would suggest reviewing your processes and documenting that, and maybe getting it reviewed by some experts could also be an additional area to look into.
That's very helpful. Ankush, just wrapping up with you, would you, from a lawyer's perspective, would you have anything to add to an SOP of sorts that a company should put in place for mitigating against these kind of events?
Yes, I do. So I think the first point, whether as a lawyer or whether as a forensic expert, I think is most important to be very, very quick to react to the situation, because there's a lot of times delay can really do a lot of damage. It could be either engaging, with a forensic expert. It could be filing a complaint. It could be appointing a lawyer. It could be just shutting down that particular system or that particular avenue for that particular employee who's been identified. It could be in any form. That's point number one. Point number two is your systems, your protocols, your IT systems. I mean, today we still speak to very, very high-end companies who manage a lot of data of insiders and outsiders, don't have any restriction of an email being sent from an employee's professional account to his personal account. And that was the first thing that we stopped. We were like, how can you allow this? We also have found, and where we have, like a standard operating procedure, sometimes the board or an important member of the company would come to us as lawyers and says, you conduct a mock raid on the client itself. And we've done this. And, and then you have a standard operating process where a designated employee of the client would call me up or call XYZ up and saying, we've handled a situation, we are facing a situation like this, how do we handle it? And at that point of time, of course, we can't give it away that it's a mock rate. So we have to literally, tell them what is to be done by the time the defined designated person reaches the employee's factory, head office, wherever it is. So typically, one of the important things here to note is that try and have local support from your teams or your experts. Because if they need to be there with you physically, I mean, it's very important. Okay, in today's COVID times, everything happens online, but in a regular day, regular working day, a lot of support, the clients feel comfort when the lawyers are there to handhold. So, reduce the time spent, reduce the time sort of is taken, and, develop such a comfort with your agencies that, you can reach out to them in the middle of the early hours of the morning, because typically the raids will happen in that fashion. Typically the raids will happen day on day for weeks. So, these are the things that one should keep in mind. Of course, last but not the least is to have, awareness being built. Continuous training, monitoring of, and also division of roles and responsibilities within the client structure. You should not have an accountant doing the role of a legal, or an legal doing the role of a business, simply because, if something were to go wrong, it will automatically show there is a confusion or a complex web of scenarios that exist within the company itself, and the company didn't do enough to, correct it at then. So this is just, of course, very, very, preliminary and broad, but a lot can be done, and a lot of emphasis can be laid to these processes. And most importantly, I think a lot of times when they say that, things have gone wrong, a lot of damage has already been done because of a late reaction internally.
Right. Thank you. That was very helpful. I think this practical approach by all the panelists has been very helpful. We'll just open this up for questions to the audience. I think we have about 10, 15 odd minutes. We are running shortly late, but we can cover 10 to 15 minutes of questions from the audience. If anyone has questions, please feel free to put it on the chat. I see that there are a few, and I'll throw it open to the panel to take it as it comes. There is a question from Mr. Arun Sivach. Data recovered during the process of an investigation, does it need to be proved by an expert witness or through the agency or the government investigating authority?
So I'll take that. I think it's more of from a lawyer's perspective. I think from a evidentiary point of view, the experts would play the role of, collecting the data. But I think as in the ground collecting, but I think the end of the day, to whom the system belongs to should be the person giving the evidence. So if it's an IT company who's running the business as a consultant or as an employee, he should be the one giving an affidavit or a statement or the process, that's required. So I don't think it will be either of the two options, but it will be the person to whom the system belongs to.
Right. So there's a question from Mandar Nayak, and Prasad, I'll direct that to you. I think you covered that slightly, but the question is, should forensic auditing of a company be done by an independent authority? I think what would also entail in this is how important is the independence of the entity while conducting the investigation?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So it has to be done by an independent authority, and typically how the agreements are structured is the report is issued to the consortium of the banks, and the appointment is done by the consortium of the banks. So the banks would appoint it, and the target who have defaulted in the loans, so there are NPA accounts. The transaction or the investigation will happen on the targets where the fraud has happened or the siphoning has happened. But the appointment is done by the banks, and the payment, again, it depends on the terms of reference. Sometimes it is the target who has to pay the agency, or the ultimate responsibility of the payment is from the target, because their audit is happening. But the independence, irrespective of where, even if it's an internal company investigation, the independence aspect cannot be ruled out, because it is not, you are appointed by the audit committee. So even if there is a allegation against the company that there are siphoning of funds or there are financial misappropriations or misreporting, the board of directors under the umbrella of audit committee would appoint an investigator, which has to be independent, and irrespective of their the reach or involvement of the directors themselves, that report has to go to the audit committee in as much detail as possible, because that's where the independence comes into picture.
Right. So Ankush, a question from Mudit Jain is, are the punishments for white collar crimes more or less than physical crimes? More on a punishments perspective, how white collar crimes are treated versus traditional hard crimes.
So as I said, Mudit, thanks for this question. It will depend on, whether it is a crime that is related to a copyright issue, or a issue relating to, some violation of a pharmaceutical product like a drug. Is it relating to something on medical negligence? And, is it relating to some cybercrime issue? So as compared to an Indian Penal Code issue, there are more or less specific statutes which exist to deal or to penalize with these, offenses. Of course, because in 1860, when the Indian Penal Code was enacted, one hadn't thought about 150 years ago, how things will evolve and continue to evolve at the rapid and drastic speed it does. Today, on a prorated basis, the punishments are higher, are stronger, are more of deterrent value, both internal and external. And, there are, of course, treaties which are entered into between India and so many other countries, about 30, 40 countries, MLAT treaties, as we call them, for punishment, for, as well as for recovering of evidence. So there is a lot that is there. So as such, there is no distinction. But if a white collar crime fits into a particular statute that exists, then we go by that statute. And usually those penalties are higher, because they will include not only arrest and detention, but they will include also attachment of properties.
Right. So another question that has come, I believe, Ankush, you may be in a position to answer this. As regards recovery of monies that are involved in a fraud, what does the law provide?
So it depends again whether it's a money laundering issue, whether it's a simple fraud issue, whether it's an EOW issue. As again depends on, and you would like to fit this case into the best possible avenue available. You would like to guess the best possible authorities, like for example, in a PMLA issue, you have the Enforcement Directorate, and they have powers of a court to large extents when it comes to evidence and even search and seizure and even attachment. So it depends again on how you fit your case. But coming to the answer, if it is an issue of this nature, you can have an Enforcement Directorate step in, as far as, the PMLA is concerned, and attach properties, and also have the powers of arrest. So I think both can sort of, fit in.
Right. So, Amit, there's a question which says that to declare an account, from Mr. R.L. Kabra, to declare an account as fraud, most of the defaulting companies do not have full records or evidence left. Hence, in this situation, how would a forensic auditor handle the situation, and whether this will sustain in a court of law?
Yeah, so I can give some, insights to this, and Prasad, feel free to add. I think in most cases, we have also sought cooperation from the other party to kind of participate in the review and share information. So for instance, for a consortium of bank, we were appointed to, investigate a diamond trading company on a default. And, initially there was a lot of resistance, but, eventually they gave in, and their initial stance, and kind of cooperated. But, in this situation, there's only limited data you can ask. You can't just go in and do forensic imaging of laptops. It was more about reviewing the books of accounts, certain payments made, to ascertain that the company has, is in a situation is due to normal course of business and not other wrongdoing. So that preliminary review happened, but then eventually, in more difficult cases, you could take the legal route, and whether through subpoena or something else, get your hands on the real evidence, which is which the company did not share, which is laptops, mobile phones, and other data. Prasad, you want to add that?
Yeah, I think that's fairly covered. And just to add, while doing a forensic audit, we also rely on certain external data. like the companies MCA records or the public domain information which is there. And whenever in such cases where it's a bank fraud or there are consortium of banks who are appointing us, we also identify a nexus of other parties or other related parties which are used to channel money, and their accounts are also maintained in more or less in these consortium banks only. So we get that information how the money has flown from one account to the other one, and using public records like MCA, etc., we see their financials, their directorships, their shareholding patterns, and establish a full linkages how the entire modus has happened. And using this information, like Amit said, we approach the court, and if there is non-cooperation, we get the court order to get the targets to divulge more information. Otherwise, in most of the cases, even this information is good enough to establish the entire chain how the money has been siphoned to various related parties using external sources as well.
So in this context, there's just a follow-up as well.
Yeah.
Would such non-cooperation be treated as a willful default as per the RBI, and not a fraud? Can such a non-cooperation be treated as a willful default? Because I assume that the question from Mr. Kabra is coming from a perspective that the non-cooperation is also resulting in non-completion of obligations to a bank or financial institution.
Yeah.
In terms of record keeping.
See,
I think
just add.
Yeah,
Sorry,
go
Ankush, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, in my knowledge, I don't think it is so well clearly defined that, what would be the cooperation in terms of, are they coming and attending a meeting and discussing a non-cooperation, or are they refusing to share some specific information that we are asking for as non-cooperation? So there has to be a case built up around it, on what do you define cooperation in this case. I don't think so that's very clear from a RBI standpoint.
Understood.
Yeah, I think it would be correct.
So Ankush, a question from Revati Mohan is, can a company be accused of having mens rea or criminal intent?
Very surprisingly for many people, the answer is actually yes. And earlier it was always, that the company is a distinct entity from the board and its KMP, and, therefore it could not have a guilty mind. But there's a very leading case which I will circulate back on the group and probably share it with IMC. You can share it onward. Is of the Standard Chartered Bank case, which is really the leading sort of this decision on this, which said that while a company can be said to have a guilty mind, of course, a company not being a living person can't be arrested or can't go through those rigors of physical punishment, but criminal sanctions can be attributed to a company. So you can lose a license, you can be made to penally pay up, you can have other exposures to regulators, as well as the Motorola case as well. So these are, two cases that were very relevant, when it came to this attribution of the mind.
Right. I think we are done on our time. If there are any further questions, we would be happy to take them up. You may, the audience may direct them to IMC advocate Nancy Sisodia, and she'll be forwarding it to us. I'll just wrap this discussion up by, first of all, thanking the panelists for their time today. Also extend mine and on behalf of the panelists, my gratitude to IMC President Mr. Ashish Vaid, the Director General Mr. Ajit Mangrulkar, Deputy Director General Mr. Sanjay Mehta, Deputy Director General Mr. Shagato Ghosh, and a special thanks to Dr. Ila Pathak Jha and Advocate Nancy Sisodia for organizing this and bringing us on this session today, as well as their team, Ms. Sia and Mr. Prajakth. I think, Selvi, we are good to go from here.
Okay. Thank you, Aviral. Thank you for that very wonderful, insightful panel discussion and the interaction also, and for handling so many questions. I think most of them were handled. So as we move to the end of the session, may I request Mr. Shagato Ghosh, Deputy Director General, IMC Chamber of Commerce and Industry, to conclude this session by presenting the vote of thanks. Over to you, Mr. Ghosh. 1 minute. I'm just unmuting you. Yeah, 1 minute. You are unmuted and I'm unmuted simultaneously. Okay.
Can you hear me? Great. Thank you, everyone. That was a wonderful session. On behalf of IMC, we thank Cyril Amarchand Mangaldas and FTI Consulting and the speakers, Mr. Prasad Shetty, Mr. Ankush Mehta, Mr. Amit Jaju, and Mr. Aviral Sahai, helping us to organize this program. The session was really very informative and insightful and a great learning for all of us. Usually we have very different kind of session, but this one was really insightful and very practical in many ways, considering the increase in online white crime kind of a things. I think just few weeks back, Paytm was done some cases on telco or something about fraud and all that because of these white collar things. So thank you very much. It was very useful for us. We thank all the participants for joining in this session and hope this session would be of help to all of you in future. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, speakers. Thank you, panelists. Thank you. Thank you, friends, for your kind cooperation, patient hearing, and active participation. Thank you.
Oh, last but not least, thank you, Selvi, for the fantastic hosting as usual.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.